Conscient Podcast, episode 197. Educator, cultural worker, and foresight expert Zan Chandler.
That's the thing about the futures work and foresight work is you need a very broad range of thinkers. You need people from different perspectives, maybe who speak different languages, who recognize different worldviews. And I think that's always why artists will be important in that process, because they are not necessarily coming from sort of mainstream culture. They may be immersed, raised in mainstream culture, but they're often trying to say, hey, there are other ways of seeing the world, and there are other ways of responding to the world that we're in right now.
I first met Zan Chandler in 1999, when we were both starting work at the Canada Council for the Arts, running interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary arts programs. And I've had the pleasure of keeping in touch with Zan over the years, and have followed her career as an arts educator, cultural worker, and expert in foresight. I've always been fascinated with various forms of futuring, so I was happy when Zan clarified a number of things, including the difference between forecasting and foresight. We talked about foresight into the future of the arts, what will happen to the arts, and also how the arts can help us anticipate better futures. Zan's journey in the arts and foresight fields began with her background in linguistics, shifting to arts through photography and film, and this led to work at the Department of Canadian Heritage on arts and film policy, and her current work is at Policy Horizons Canada. So during our conversation, Zan noted that artists are very good at sensing societal shifts and addressing various forms of injustices. Our conversation explored the potential of art and artists in foresight work, such as storytelling and emotional connections. Zan essentially suggests that the inclusion of artists in foresight work can help challenge our assumptions and introduce new and valuable perspectives. We also talked about the impact of COVID.
While I might have been a little doom and gloom about what happened during COVID and how devastating some of the impacts were on the arts community, I think one thing that came through strongly for me was how the innate need to create together, regardless of what the context was, remained. And we have so many examples of the creative sector coming together to raise spirits.
Now, one of my takeaways, if not my prognosis, is that we need to be prepared for multiple outcomes while remaining open and actively working on new possibilities.
That's the idea around foresight. If you imagine that it's possible, you've at least started to think about, what do I have to do if this happens? And how do I recognize that it might be beginning to happen?
Welcome to Conscient Podcast, Zan.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, we've known each other for a while. I was just saying that I think the first time was when you were running the Quest program at Canada Council in early 2000s.
That's correct, yes.
Sound ring a bell?
I think the very first deadline was September 1999.
Uh-huh.
It did so well. We had a second deadline in 2000.
And since then, we've been crossing paths. Most recently at a dinner, and I was saying, "Oh, it'd be fun to have you on my podcast because of your work in arts and culture, but also in the field of foresight as opposed to forecasting." And you'll explain all that to us in a minute. But I'm really happy that you're here because a lot of what I've been doing this season is around a type of futurism, anticipating, thinking about the future through the arts. You know, what have the arts told us in the past? What do they mean to us now? And how can they help us anticipate, plan, and so on and so forth. But before we get into foresight, why don't you just give us an overview of your background, who you are, where you come from, that kind of thing.
Right. I'll try not to go back too far, but I originally from the UK and came here as a teenager, and so I think I see life in Canada in a way that's slightly different to folks who have grown up here, but also probably very similar to folks who've come from away, as they say. I had no idea when I went off to university, when I went to U of T and I studied linguistics, that I was going to end up either in the arts or then in the foresight field. I think, as I like to say about getting involved in government, I tripped and fell into, and I think that's what happened in all of those. I got involved in the arts because I decided to go and spend some time in Australia. And I thought, why don't I take some pictures? It's such a completely different place there compared to what I had experienced. And then I took a photography class at a place in Sydney and started taking pictures. And then that led to getting involved in film and video. And that's how I ended up at council. Because I was working for a film co-op and had met David Poole, who was head of media arts at the time. And then he passed my resume on to Sharon Fernandez, who was standing up the Quest program. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we met. And then after much time in the arts, some time at council, I ended up sliding over to Canadian Heritage, working in both arts policy and film policy. And after some time there, I was lucky enough to work on a project. It was at the time where digital technologies, things like YouTube and peer-to-peer file sharing were starting to really blow up. And the cultural policy community was saying, oh, our policy frameworks do not know how to respond to this. So we need to do some study. And I would say that's how I got into foresight. We did a foresight project. We didn't know we were doing a foresight or futures project at the time. We didn't even know what that was, but we were aware things are changing. There are implications for the arts and the cultural industries and for instruments, funding, programs, tax credits, things like that. But we don't know what the future could look like, so we need to think about that more deeply. And that is kind of the first step into the future space for me. But it wasn't until a couple of years later that I actually did formal studies when I went back to Toronto.
And now I know you do at least two things. You work at Policy Horizons Canada as a senior, what do you call
foresight analyst.
I like that. That's a nice title. And you teach at OCAD University, and I'd like to hear about both of those. But maybe we can start. I mean, I know there's more to your background than what you said, but it'll weave its way through the conversation, I'm sure. Because even myself, I'm confused about terminology. I was looking this morning at the notion of forecasting, which is a word and multiple definitions, as opposed to foresight. So maybe you can give us a 101 on just what are we talking about here?
Sure.
Futurism and all that stuff.
Right. Okay. And so that's another one too. Futurism is so often used in the foresight sense. but also has very specific meaning in an art sense. And so sometimes there can be confusion over that. So often we'll say the futures space. And the reason why we say futures is because this is the fundamental difference between forecasting and foresight. Forecasting tends to be taking data and extrapolating into the future, and it usually speaks about one future, more along the lines of prediction. And foresight is about understanding an array, a range of possible futures. So we're not saying this will happen. We're saying this may happen. This may also happen if the context changes. This may also happen. And the benefit of looking at multiple futures, and we often talk about the future in this plural sense, because we are trying to be sensitized to the possibility of change. So if we're aware that the future can be different to what we might expect, what is the probable future, what is business as usual, then we are better prepared to either anticipate where changes are or react when change happens more swiftly than if we were believing the future is just going to go along this path and then we're sideswiped, like many people were during COVID. Whereas those who
Yet that was anticipated.
It was anticipated, certainly. I mean, the foresight community had been talking about a big pandemic is going to hit. It's going to be global. Lots of people will be killed. It will radically transform the way that we live our lives for several years. And policymakers were informed. And we're not saying that policymakers didn't make changes. Of course, they can't make changes without the support to do so. And some changes were made. And so if we were, and I think this is increasingly important as we go forward, if we are sensitive to how things might happen and plan accordingly. So we've had one big pandemic. Epidemiologists tell us that there will be more. We've had the experience of living through COVID. Let's not forget that. So let's be prepared if we get hit with something else that might not be airborne like COVID was. It might be more of a contact thing, but we at least know how to rapidly mobilize because we've had the experience of COVID, but we'd had SARS and we'd had H1N1 and maybe we had forgotten some of that or some of the processes were not the most up to date. But that's the idea around foresight. If you imagine that it's possible, you've at least started to think about what do I have to do if this happens? And how do I recognize that it might be beginning to happen?
And it's a broad field that one could spend a lot of time talking about and fleshing out. But I want to focus on the relationship of the arts and foresight, because the arts are a form of foresight. I think it's the time for me to bring out the Marshall McLuhan quote I told you about from Understanding Media. The power of the arts to anticipate, that's another nice word, anticipation, future social and technological developments by a generation or more, and of course it could be much more. I'll stop interjecting in the quote here, or else people won't understand. Has long been recognized in this century, as Raban called the antenna of the race. Art as radar acts as an early alarm system, as it were, enabling us to discover social and psychic targets in lots of time to prepare to cope with them. This concept of the arts as prophetic contrasts with the popular idea of them as mere self-expression. So that's Marshall McLuhan, taken with a grain of salt. It was a long time ago, but he was on to something there.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, I do believe this. And part of it is because I studied foresight in an art and design institution. So we are already sensitized to the way that artists can sense change and can foreshadow change in different ways. One of the key activities that we're involved in when we're trying to think about how the future might be different and how we might need to respond to that is an activity called horizon scanning. So what it is you're sending your senses out there in different ways. You might be reading, you might be listening to podcasts, you might be going to art galleries, you might be listening to folks on the street, listening to news, to try to understand what is a really light vibration of something that's different, something a little weird, but that could spell change in the future. And artists are amazing at that. Whether we're talking science fiction writers like Octavia Butler, who, I mean, during the
Life is change.
Exactly. I read The Parable of the Sower during COVID, during the Trump years. And I remember just my jaw dropped thinking, in 1975, I think she wrote this, it was in the 70s, she had anticipated a similar president. She had anticipated a world post sort of apocalypse or civil war, some of the tensions that we're beginning to feel a little more strongly here, environmental tensions as well. So certainly writers, I think anybody who's doing speculative writing or even just highly creative writing where they're breaking the reality of today, but also visual artists. I think they're so important for horizon scanning, for this activity of trying to anticipate what may be happening, what's happening just as a very light vibration on the edges of our consciousness, or they might be a really strong image right in front of us. And artists, I think, are always sensing. I think they're sensitive to changes and recognizing stuff. Often artists are, they may be counterculture. They may be thinking about, we don't like what's happening right now. How could things be different? Or they could be drawing attention to injustices in other parts of the world or within their own communities. They're thinking about how things could be different. So from a very clinical research perspective, I think the arts are really important as a contribution to that kind of the art and science of anticipation, which is what we sometimes call foresight as well. But also, I think in terms of providing images of the future. So what's the future we want to avoid, or what are the futures we want to embrace? And who, I think artists are deeply engaged in those kinds of questions all the time.
One of the reports from the organization that you work for is called Disruptions, which was disruptive to me because I spent a lot of time reading things, and that one kind of hits hard because it anticipates. Now, not all these things will necessarily happen because you can't predict the future just because. But that's an interesting exercise to look at realistic projections based not just on data but trends. I mean, social trends. I assume there's a complex science to all of this, right? So that's where it gets discouraging when you look at the trends, and for instance, just climate change by itself is very worrying because of the melting of the ice caps and flooding and all that. So how do you sleep at night? Spending all day, I guess it's not all negative, right?
Yeah, I think you have to balance. I mean, it could be very easy just to spend a lot of time getting lost in the sea of negative stuff. A well-regarded, internationally regarded foresighter who I'm happy to count as a friend and a former, as well as a current board member on the Association of Professional Futurists, Patricia Lustig. She's originally from the Netherlands but resides in the UK. And she has a Substack called It's Not All Bad. And her focus is to present some of the good signs, the things that are going well. And I think you need to balance between the good and the bad. But there are, right now there are lots of things that are pointing to bad. But I think there also are people and organizations and movements that are trying to make better out of the bad. or trying to create great things, good things. So yeah, it's not all bad, but the trend doesn't look great in certain areas. I mean, if you're thinking about climate change, absolutely, right? I mean, will we as the human race, will we survive in the long term? We'd like to think yes. Like to think that we will change our ways of being and find a way to move forward. Of course, the techno-optimists will insist that technology is the way that's going to help us get to the other side. I'm not convinced that it's going to be that magic wand that will come up with some technology that will take carbon out of the atmosphere.
Well, if you think of human spirituality as a technology, then that
yes. If you have that's a really important point. If you take a broader interpretation of what technology is, then absolutely, yeah.
I was being facetious, but I
agree with you though. I agree with you because I did a podcast. No, I did a video, a webinar. That's right, with friends of Foresight or Friends of Futures. I can't remember now. And it was a really interesting panel of thinkers around the futures world and a fairly broad interpretation of that. People coming from lots of different places. So people speaking on decoloniality and strictly from a foresight methodology space, from a biology space, and spirituality and whatnot. And Frank Spencer, who was the guy who invited me, he'd be a really interesting person for you to talk to. Mm-hmm. So Frank, who invited me to participate, asked me to talk about ancestral futures, which was something I've had these off-the-cuff conversations with him about. And because I had talked to him about, we need to be in greater connection with what I would consider the knowledges that we've had in the past, that some communities, some peoples still have as very contemporary, and some of our cultures and societies have lost. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, remembering our connection to the planet, that we are part of nature, not separate from it, in the same way that we separate our head from our body. Like modernity would have us be separate in that way, separate from animals, separate from the plants and the trees and the land. But we're all made of the same stuff. And we are not just our heads. We have neurons in our gut, not just in our heads and the spinal cord. We have neurons. So we feel and we know through our bodies. And I think a lot of us in the West have lost that connection. And especially for communities too that have been separated from their ancestral knowledges because of colonization and because of the transatlantic slave trade. Some peoples have been able to maintain some of that knowledge, and you get vestiges of that. And I recognize that now as an adult when I look back on the years that I spent in the Caribbean. I was lucky enough to spend from age 5 to 10 in Barbados, which is a great place to be in the 70s. Very free, very open. And my mother was insistent that I went to the West African Cultural Center every Sunday, and I did dance and music and we listened to stories. And when I hear stories from my father about his mother and his grandparents and how they knew about the herbs and the plants, and if you were feeling sick, then you take this, if you were tired, if you had pains, all of that kind of knowledge that those of us in big cities here might no longer have. But some folks who are living more closely to the land have managed to maintain. It's still very much knowledge. It's not ancestral knowledge. It's the knowledge that they work with every day. So I'm trying to bring in those kinds of ideas into the foresight space. Let's not just focus on what's written in academic reports or policy documents and things like that. And I know there are foresighters around the world who have stronger connections to different knowledges.
embodied knowledges, we've been talking about that. Shannon Litzenberger talks about her own practice as
Right.
a dance, embodied learning, and I've
Mm-hmm.
done courses with her, and I have a daily Qigong practice, which helps me get out of my head into my
Mm-hmm.
body. A lot of people are doing that. I was listening to a podcast yesterday that was all about, those knowledges that are in us just need to either come back or come to the forefront. And then tremendous potentials are then unleashed in humans as they have in the past. And civilizations have come and gone. My son studies history, so he looks more back. You look more forward, but it's all interconnected. And I feel that the arts have that potential to kind of help us navigate those waters through allegory and through illusion, and because we're so rational, at least the modern world has taught us to be, and it's meant to be a good thing, and there are good parts of it, but we've, as you say, cut off parts of our being, and we're suffering as a result of that,
Absolutely.
chopping off,
Absolutely. That separation between the head and the body, we are disconnected from our bodies and dissociated from the planet. I mean, I talk to more and more people who are feeling like their connection to the ground. I mean, they're floating. They're not feeling connected to place. They're not feeling connected. I mean, they're barely feeling connected in their bodies as well. And I think a lot of that has to do with rational thought, and they spend so much time in their heads. I've been part of that. That's been for a long time for me. I think that has also been. I mean, I'm trying to untangle for myself the journey, the impact of colonization on my family line from both sides. Like my mom was Irish, and from the Republic of Ireland, which has been battling with British rule for many hundreds of years. My father's family is from the Caribbean more recently, but he traces his roots back to Sierra Leone. We don't know exactly how he got to the Caribbean. There's evidence for many things. And so you can see the impact of colonization and modernity in the sense of severing that connection with place and severing that connection with your body. That anything that feels too embodied, like music and dance, and particularly for people with black bodies, if they engage in that kind of thing, it's connected with primitivism, right? It's not connected with knowledge from a Western colonial perspective. And so I think that after the time I spent in the Caribbean, where I felt a deeper connection to that ancestry in that sense, and then going back to England at age 10 and then having all of that stuff be poo-pooed, right? So I'm trying to uncover a lot of that now as an older person. And I'm finding that there are many connections then with the futures world because of how important it is. You mentioned that your son studies history, and I think some of the best futurists are historians because change happens at different rates. If you think of change as a wave, some waves are fast and furious, and some of them are slow and unravel over a long period of time. Right? If you think of even just sound waves, different frequencies. And so there are some changes that we are experiencing that started hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. So especially if you're talking about the environment, ecological changes, some are happening much more frequently now, but some of those changes started millennia ago. So that's why it's really important to think about history as well when you're thinking about the future, because what we're experiencing now didn't necessarily start now. We might be in the middle of that change.
Well, just a few days ago, I had a conversation with an Australian Indigenous scholar, Yin Paradies. I was telling you about him and his work around primal cultures versus modern cultures. And it's interesting to just look back, and you can call them indigenous cultures, but we get tripped up with language because
Mm-hmm.
of colonialization and who's what. But anyway, that's why I think he uses that language. And it's interesting to think what smaller communities have done. In terms of volume, communities, in terms of reciprocity and support, and it's not all good and it's not all bad. But when we remember that humanity has been able to live in a sustainable way, even with large volumes of people, right? It's not just the small; it's the system. So we have a broken system that seems to work, right? Because we're always burning our bridges, and there's not many bridges left, Zan. But so I enjoy conversations and they literally move me emotionally. Like what we just spoke earlier, when you talked about vibrations, minute vibrations, I could feel that. And so there's power in these stories and these silences that we have, togetherness. And so I haven't quite given up on humanity when I hear stories like that, when I hear you speak about the sophistication of the many ways that we can foresight into our futures, right? Olivia Butlers of the world, the great writers who have prophesized what could be, all of that entanglement is fascinating and terrifying, right? So my question is, how can artists, just everyday artists who are trying to make a living and recovering from COVID and, looking for a place to live, all those kind of things, how can they benefit from, apart from taking your courses at OCAD, how can they benefit from the culture of foresight that you're working in, and how can they, have more of that in their lives so that they can know the culture, the history, and maybe a bit of the methodology. I think it would be interesting to have a bit more literacy around foresight for us to feel more, involved in that part of life, which is very speculative, but also very much in the present, right? Just because what we feel now is what can become. Anyway, long rant here, but what do you think?
Well, I think a few things. One, I think artists are probably already fairly well versed in how to do a lot of the foresight work that is just innate in humans who are seeing and thinking and making connections and responding to the world around them. And so my advice would be, don't negate that. Understand that that's really important. That's an important role in society to play. But if you're interested in learning more about the methodologies that quote unquote professional futurists and foresight analysts and practitioners use, there are lots of ways. You don't have to become a methodologist. There are lots of great books out there. I'm thinking of my former classmate at OCAD. I teach there, but I'm also a graduate of the program I teach in. And my former classmate, Madeline Ashby, is a science fiction author, trained as a foresighter. And she and a colleague of ours from the US, but who lives in Europe, Scott Smith, wrote a book a few years ago called How to Future. And it's very easy read, based sort of aimed at organizations, but you can certainly do this in your own practice with some tools, ways of thinking. Really, foresight is a methodology to help you think about the future in a structured way. But as an artist, if you want to do this kind of work to inform the work that you do, this could be very interesting too, to think about the tools and the techniques, but also to perhaps place you in the position of saying, well, to a foresight team who are looking to do a study, you need someone like me. I used to work in a design firm that did foresight work, and both of the presidents of the firm were designers. One was a product designer, and the other one was a communication designer, graphic designer specifically for books and things like that. He is also a visual artist, practicing visual artist, and they would be the first people to stand up and say, if you're going to have this kind of project, you need to have artists involved because they think differently and they see differently. And they're trained to do so through their practice or their studies. So I think I would be very much in the first group of people saying, hey, we need some artists involved in this because we need someone to challenge the status quo. We need someone who thinks differently and who's going to speak up about different things. That's the thing about the futures work and foresight work, is you need a very broad range of thinkers. You need people from different perspectives, maybe who speak different languages, who recognize different worldviews. And I think that's always why artists will be important in that process, because they are not necessarily coming from sort of mainstream culture. They may be immersed, raised in mainstream culture, but they're often trying to say, hey, there are other ways of seeing the world, and there are other ways of responding to the world that we're in right now.
I remember a specific session I had at Policy Horizons when I was working at Canada Council. I don't remember if you were there or not, but a number of my colleagues were there, and we were, speculating about the future, what's the future of touring, and what this and that. And then and still today, I wonder, what are the assumptions that we make when we project into the future? Do we assume that the world will continue to have the kind of energy that we have now? Do we assume that the kind of repression of colonialism can and should continue? There's all kinds of things that we kind of take for granted in our, I did. I just assumed that, let's just, sure, more touring or, better touring or whatever. But it really struck me that there's that the assumption piece is problematic. Is what do you believe to be a stable, fair world?
Mm-hmm.
And the world isn't stable or fair. It's really quite unjust. So what about assumptions and that kind of thing?
Assumptions are a really important part of futures work, and I think solid foresight projects will bring assumptions in at least two different places within a process. Certainly at the beginning, say in a policy context, if we were doing this with a group of policy thinkers around the arts, those questions that you asked would be fundamental at the very beginning. To think about what are the assumptions that are embedded in the policies. Right? That touring is something that we want to do more of, that it's a good thing. And it's important to surface those and have a good discussion about that in order to be really conscious, overtly conscious, explicitly conscious about what are the assumptions that are built in to the way that we do what we do in the policy frameworks, in the program guidelines, all of that kind of stuff. And then if you were going to do a more robust foresight project, and even if you weren't, even if you were just going to spend some time saying, how might the world be different? And if you just dreamt up a few different stories about the future that were based on slightly different circumstances of the world, and then you could go back to your assumptions and say, okay, the assumptions that we had about why we do the work, how we do the work, for whom we do the work, are they vulnerable in these new states? If the world changes, are the assumptions that we have made about why it's important for the public sector to support the arts or encourage the arts to evolve in a certain way, is that vulnerable in a different future? And certainly COVID was a perfect example of this. We assumed that people could meet and gather in the same place to enjoy the arts together, or even to make art, to collaborate. We assumed that people would be able to tour, and all of those assumptions about the arts sector, people congregating, traveling, sharing, of works were immediately shown to be vulnerable when we could not move, we could not breathe the same air as other people, and it had a devastating impact on touring artists, or not just touring artists. I mean, you just think about what happened. Well, I mean, it precipitated a move that was happening already, say, in the audiovisual sector. We didn't go to movie theaters as much. We were stopping going to movie theaters anyway. That's been a long trend, 20 years or so or more. But no longer being able to go see music or theater or dance. That was devastating. And had we done that work and to think about what's going to happen to arts organizations or individual artists if they can't do the things that they rely on doing now?
Well, an example, I attended a meeting that Mass Culture organized with Canada Council a few weeks ago, arts service organizations talking about climate change, and it was quite refreshing. Ben Twist from Scotland was there as a guest, and it was really interesting, and I think very mature, though premature in the sense that it's only the beginning of complexities. But Vicky Stroick from the Caravan Farm Theatre was there talking about the wildfires in BC and how that's a very real thing in terms of audiences, because sometimes you can't breathe enough to attend a performance, which is not unlike a pandemic where you can't be together, you know. And without becoming too doomist about these things are the realities in Canada and much worse in other places of the world in terms of heats and floods and those kinds of things. So we will adapt, right, because humans adapt and are quite resilient. And we will anticipate, I hope, that these things are not desirable and change our behaviors. And they are happening. Like you said earlier, there's lots of change going on. But is it enough change? Is it the right kind of change? Are the dots interconnected in ways that will allow that change to be transformative? We don't know. But I enjoyed the fact that we were talking about real things and the power of the arts. We didn't use that word, but just how the arts make a real difference in terms of storytelling and people being together, convening. You know, even if it's online, during COVID, there were lots of very important scales started online during COVID, you know, the Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency, which continues to this day. But there was a positive outcome of a crisis. We had a terrible thing. Maybe we could have anticipated it, but whatever, you know, society is whatever.
As they say, hindsight is 20/20.
Whatever that means. Anyway, my point is that the next season, we're at July 14th today, and in a few weeks I'll be wrapping up this season, which is about the end of the world as we know it, and planting the seeds for other worlds to emerge. Next season, I'm going to look at the arts in periods of crisis and how arts have played in the past in Canada and other places important roles and how they can in the future. So there'll be some foresighting. I like that verb, to foresight. Je foresight, tu foresight, nous foresighton. And then looking at, not in a negative way, but in a realistic way, how the arts can play an important role in these moments of great difficulty on the planet, and then look at regeneration.
Right.
The positive sides of it, but have, like you said earlier, that balance.
Oh, well, I look forward to that. You know, while I might have been a little doom and gloom about what happened during COVID and how devastating some of the impacts were on the arts community, I think one thing that came through strongly for me was how the innate need to create together, regardless of what the context was, remained. And we have so many examples of the creative sector coming together to raise spirits and to create in new ways. When I think about some of the amazing musical collaborations that, because of digital technologies, were able to happen from around the world. I mean, that feels like completely like another world, another time. When I would sit and watch on Facebook some of these videos, these compositions made with musicians around the world, because that's what they had available. And I think the arts sector is amazing that way in its ability to create under different constraints. And I think that the arts are such an important part of human society that it's not going to disappear, that artists will adapt. Some artists will not be able to make that transition, or want to. And other artists will be born from it, I think. So I think, going forward, as particularly as we think about how the climate situation is not going to get better in the short term, how I think that artists, because they are creative, lateral thinkers, will find ways of making art, of bringing people together, and also fulfilling the role of maybe court jester, in the sense that would have the ability to point out to leadership and say, this is stupid. We need to do things differently, or what you're planning, what you're doing here is silly.
Or to touch an emotional chord,
Mm-hmm.
which is in contrast to all that sort of pseudo-rational thought.
Yes.
Much of which is denialist, because it's not grounded in reality, it's grounded in some fictional. We think of the Thunberg, what's her first name?
Greta.
Greta, when she spoke at Davos, that these are fairy tales. Like, I never forgot that. That you are talking about, you're living in a world of fairy tales,
Yes.
and my generation is being abandoned, right? That was so powerful.
Yeah.
Because fairy tales are wonderful when they're fiction.
Yes.
Or they can become, stories that help us understand through metaphor and all this. But when we think of reality as a made-up, very short-term world, we're cheating future generations, and we're cheating other species.
Mm-hmm.
We're mistreating them, and we're mistreating ourselves through the unhealthy relations we have with the other forms of life. And that gets into the more than human stuff, which is, we could talk about another time. 'Cause
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also very happy to say that I have some friends in the foresight world who are working very actively to make sure that the more than human aspects of life on this planet are taken into account, because a lot of this work, if you think about the historical roots, yes, humans have had this ability to anticipate, have always had it, but this structured way of doing it for strategic benefit, or for strategic outcomes, whether we're talking about the roots in the sort of military defense space, where a lot of the methods that we use today were developed. Foresight has been an important tool for the military space, as well as big business, anticipating things that could disrupt their profit margins, that kind of thing. I think it's really important that this work is also happening to think more, to move out of that rational profit-based risk management space into dreaming what the world could be like, better worlds for more than just humans.
Nicely said. It makes the case for a type of cultural foresighting, which is essentially what you're doing, because you're specialized in arts and culture. We'll leave it there, because I think it's a lot for people to digest. And I'll certainly put the books and other things that you've mentioned in the episode notes. But I always end with, what you're reading or listening to these days that you would, it can just be one or two things that's on your bedside, but it's just something that you would recommend that's stimulating and worth sharing.
So many things. I think one of the things that's important for this kind of work is to read very broadly. So over the last few years, I've been reading, I've been trying to read works from important Indigenous writers. So Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which was just beautiful, as well as a great opportunity to learn. Tyson Yunkaporta's Sand Talk also fits in that, and I'm looking forward to his follow-up book. But I've also been reading about trauma and about nervous system regulation, and I think the works of Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk, or their books, When the Body Says No and The Body Keeps the Score, really highlight how important it is for us to integrate head and body, mind and body, and also be connected to the planet, which I think is important for this kind of futuring work, thinking about the future, being cognizant of the past, recognizing what's happening in the present. So those are some of the things that I have read recently that influence the things that I will continue to read and work on. So, I mean, it's like futuring for the body, for my body. Like at the same time, I'm doing that for me. I'm thinking about my place in this world and where I'll be in the decades to come, if I have that long, as well as thinking about, that's just a micro version of a more macro, society, the planet.
Zan Chandler, thanks so much for this conversation. We'll talk again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.